When Percy Jackson receives an urgent distress call from his friend Grover, he immediately prepares for battle. He knows he'll need his powerful demigod allies at his side, his trusty bronze sword Riptide, and a ride from his mom. The demigods race to the rescue to find that Grover has made an important discovery: two new powerful half-bloods whose parentage is unknown. But that's not all that awaits them. The Titan Lord Kronos has set up a devious trap, and the young heroes have just fallen prey. Hilarious and action-packed, this third adventure in the series finds Percy faced with his most dangerous challenge yet: the chilling prophecy of the Titan's curse. Today I'll be reviewing The Titan's Curse, the third book in the Percy Jackson and the Olympians series. What else is there for me to say in this intro? There will be spoilers, so pause the video if you haven't read this one yet, and then hit play once you've finished reading it. And away we go! Chapter 1. My rescue operation goes very wrong. A lot of stuff to unpack in this chapter. It's definitely a great introduction, and I kind of like that we don't quite know what kind of monster Dr. Thorne actually is. It was focused more on the rescue mission Percy and his friends were in, rather than give us an immediate fight sequence. Percy's kind of jealous that Thalia's now the de facto leader of the group. He's gotten used to being the one who finds a way to solve their problems, but with Thalia around, the seniority goes to her. I mean, it makes sense, since she's the daughter of Zeus and Percy's Poseidon's son, which puts him below the hierarchy of power. Poseidon's the third child too. Hades is the middle child of the big three. Maybe that's why nobody cares about him. We're introduced briefly to two new characters named Bianca and Nico D'Angelo. It's either D'Angelo or D'Angelo. Or D'Angelo. D'Angelo. I'm gonna go with D'Angelo. Bianca and Nico D'Angelo. Can't say much about them yet because there literally wasn't much to work off of in this chapter. But in other news, Annabeth's taller than Percy, which is fair. Give Percy more life disadvantages. He needs it. As a protagonist, of course. Chapter 2. The Vice Principal gets a missile launcher. Now that's how you make a cool introduction. So many awesome things to talk about in this chapter. Dr. Thorne is a manticore, which is a monster that has a body of a lion, the head of a man, and the tail of a scorpion. And then you have Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, arrive at the scene. In the second book, at the very end of the story, there was this Deus Ex Machina moment that really infuriated me because of how and why it was executed. This chapter has that same kind of event happen, but it was just executed so well. So perfectly, even. I don't know what the deal is with Thalia and Zoe Nightshade yet, but I'm excited to read more about it. They obviously encountered each other before, but other than that, I have no idea. I can't remember anymore. Annabeth plunges down with the manticore, so I guess she'll be absent for this third book, which makes sense since we need to see more of Thalia this time around. This chapter was really great, and I'm very excited for what's to come. Chapter 3. Bianca D'Angelo makes a choice. The Battle of the Genders. I knew this series would come to this eventually. I'm not opposed to it so far. The way the pledge of being a hunter was explained very nicely, I would say, and it was established in the first book that Artemis was one of the 12 Olympians who didn't have any offspring. Therefore, nobody lived in her cabin in Camp Half-Blood. But this time around, we'll get to see the hunters gain access to the Artemis cabin for the meantime. Nico is interesting. The farthest book I read in this franchise was The Son of Neptune, and I didn't really get to read Mark of Athena because I never bought the book.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
But I know what Nico's gonna end up being in that series, and since I haven't gotten that far, I'm gonna reserve my thoughts on it and focus on how Nico's handled in this story. So far, Nico's interesting. He's got a bunch of playing cards and figurines based on various Greek icons. He's 10 years old and Percy's like, what, 13 to 14 at this point? So I get the age difference in terms of their likes and dislikes. and I'm not very fond of hanging out with kids in that age because of their hyperactive energy. So I get where Percy is coming from. But back in the day, I also collected cards and was interested in tabletop games. But as I grew up, I left that in the past, mostly out of financial difficulty. Anyway, this was a really good chapter. It was just kind of weird that Bianca immediately wanted to become a hunter because of a short talk with Lady Artemis. I thought she would at least check the camp out first, and then choose which path to take. But I guess being a hunter is cool as hell. I mean, immortality? Who wouldn't want that? Unfortunately, I'm a man. Can't be a hunter. Chapter 4. Thalia Torches New England. This chapter makes me want to read through the rest of this series, as well as Heroes of Olympus, so that I can read more about Apollo's trials. Or Trials of Apollo. I want to see more of Apollo. He seems like a cool guy, which is funny because he's the sun god. I like the irritated sister vibe from Artemis towards her brother, and Apollo's unapologetic riz towards Thalia. Although that's kind of problematic, considering they're kind of half-siblings, and Apollo's basically immortal, which makes this a grooming situation.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
Okay, we need to move on, but I do love that sibling vibe the twins have with each other. It makes them feel less like gods and more like ordinary people. I don't know why Apollo's giving Percy the silent treatment though. That's kind of interesting to explore further. Chapter 5. I place an underwater phone call. Thank the heavens above for this chapter. It fixes so many things I hated about the second book and gives more stuff to love in this series. Percy dreams about Annabeth's current whereabouts and finds Luke in the dream. He's struggling to carry something on his back and successfully gets Annabeth to carry the burden for him, trapping her under the weight of this obscure darkness. This is the kind of Luke I've been looking for. 2 steps ahead, knows what he's doing, is deceptive, and a mischievous opponent. Not whatever he was in the second book. Screw that. Moving on from all that, I think Apollo can see the future. Or his mind is in a 4th dimensional level of some kind.
Marty, it's perfect. You're just not thinking 4th dimensionally.
Right, I have a real problem with it.
Maybe that's why he said that one sentence to Percy in this chapter. He knows what's about to happen to Percy, but doesn't want to interfere or change it. Maybe he finds it fascinating, because the gods tend to do that. Now it kind of makes sense that he was trying to flirt with Thalia in the last chapter. If he could see the future, then he already knows that Thalia is gonna take up the honor of being one of Artemis's hunters. He was trying to work his charm to hopefully get her to not pledge to his sister. Or maybe I'm reading into this too much. Let me know in the comments if you think there's some sense to what I'm saying here. Chapter 6. An old dead friend comes to visit. I remember Percy and Thalia's fight in this chapter very fondly. The first time I read it years ago, and even as I read it again this time around, the epicness of their fight is truly a high point of this series. Which is interesting because we see Percy at his lowest point so far. His friend Annabeth is missing. He saw a hunter's brochure from her stuff, making it seem like she was considering joining. And then he saw the scarf of Aphrodite that Annabeth kept all these years from their first quest, up in the attic with the oracle. So Percy's mind and heart are racing with such mixed emotions that him letting it out once he's pushed to the edge was just a chef's kiss to this chapter. And the fact that you can also look at it as Zeus and Poseidon's children battling it out with each other makes it even cooler to think about. I'll never get tired of reading this part of the story. That's what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. Chapter 7. Everyone hates me but the horse. This is the 3rd time a chapter is titled inaccurately, but I'll let it pass. Only because I like the other things that happened in the chapter. The council meeting for the quest was really nice. I liked how the side characters were all there. Beckendorf, Selene Beauregard, and the Stoll brothers. They're honestly always fun to read because you get to read so little of them. I can imagine them having a slice of life story arc happening behind the scenes, since they're the year-round campers. I just wish Clarice was there too, just minding her own business, but I get why she's absent in this one. Zoe kind of took the aggressor personality role for this book, so having 2 of them would feel redundant. Although, since Clarice is a girl, it would have been interesting to see whether Zoe would recruit her into being a hunter or not. I don't know what Clarice would have chosen to do, but it would definitely be something entertaining to read about. Who the hell is Phoebe? She's just this random hunter character that was plucked out of nowhere, and Blackjack's name was never established, at least from my recollection. I get that he's a black-maned horse, but come on, at least give us a sentence or two to clarify that. Did Percy give it to him, or did the horse name himself that? Chapter 8. I make a dangerous promise. Blackjack is the MVP, dude. He asks Percy to help a trapped cow serpent underwater and comes up to him at the end to give him a ride even though Percy's wearing the invisibility cap. What a cool Pegasus. Nico's interesting too. He reminds me of Percy in book 1 with how innocent but devious he is in the things he does or says, breaking the rules like it was made of tissue paper. The only other thing for me to note about this chapter was how long the underwater scenes were. The narrations were, well, they were long. They expounded a lot when it came to how the whole system worked for Percy, and I get it. Percy's the main character. This is his point of view, and this is probably his expertise. That's why he knows a lot and narrates a lot when it comes to these kinds of topics. Oh, and Phoebe's out of the quest. She really is just a throwaway character in this one. Chapter 9. I learn how to grow zombies. The first part of this chapter was just where the book cover was based off of. Mr. D catches up to Percy and Blackjack and slowly strangles them in vines. He tells a brief summary of the tale of Ariadne and sends Percy on his way. I've never hated Dionysus at all. Every scene he's in is honestly a treat to me. In a world where there are gods and monsters, he's the most lax-feeling character out of everybody. He's the guy who's self-aware of what's happening and just doesn't really care because he also has his own priorities going on and just wants all of this to be done so that he can go back home to Olympus and just relax for eternity. As for the other events of this chapter, Luke is written really well again. Less is more, as they say, and he kind of works well right now since he's not at his 100% and is being treated as a lower subject since he's working with Dr. Thorne and the General, which is probably a Titan. I can't remember who this was supposed to be, but based on the clues given on the previous chapters, this is probably Atlas. Chapter 10. I break a few rocket ships. Action sequences are always fun to read, but they're always quick somehow. This one in particular gave Percy a chance to show his might and ingenuity to Zoe when fighting against a monster, who has been averse to Percy up until this point. Now that she's seen what he can do, the value of his presence on this quest, she can no longer deny that he's important to their survival. Other than that, this was a quick chapter to read. Moving on. Chapter 11. Grover gets a Lamborghini. A lot to unpack in this one. Bianca and Nico were probably stuck inside the Lotus Hotel for a long time until something or someone plucked them out, which allowed both of them to play a role in the same prophecy Percy and Thalia were intertwined with. Although, that's just my theory. Apollo stated that he can see the future. Some of the future. Not all of it. But that still confirms my theory from a few chapters ago. Apollo was vague towards Percy because he knows a lot of things involving Percy that makes it difficult to interact with him very early on in the events. It's kind of like Tenet, where Percy is going forwards in time and Apollo is going backwards, or something to that effect. Percy's dream in this chapter was an interesting one to read, since he's the current wielder of Riptide, and Riptide's been through many owners. That probably allowed him to gain access to one of its forebears, which means the sword is a couple centuries old, much like Zoe Nightshade is. Thalia's brief talk with Percy was also interesting. It's established that she didn't want to be a hunter because she had feelings for Luke, and she also gave a hint as to why Annabeth was also considering joining the hunters, although I'm not sure what the reason is yet. Chapter 12. I go snowboarding with a pig. I don't know what it is about Grover that I just don't find him very interesting. It's not that I don't like Grover, it's just that I don't have much interest in his character altogether. Maybe because he's not a half-blood, and his quest for Pan doesn't really spark an interest in me as well. Why? I don't know. Out of everything that's happening in this series, Grover seems to have the most stretched out character development. Maybe it's because he also ages slower than ordinary people. No, that's not why. I don't know. Even with such a good action sequence present in this chapter, it just feels like the quest for Pan always seems like something that's forced upon in the current story. Like, they're already dealing with so many things, and then suddenly out of nowhere, Grover's arc gets mixed up in all of it. And it always feels like it's just not the right timing for this kind of stuff. It's never set up correctly in earlier chapters, and just appears out of nowhere. Like the Erymanthean boar. That's the name of the giant pig in this chapter. Chapter 13, we visit the junkyard of the gods. This could have been split into 2 chapters. The first half being the part where Percy is visited by Aphrodite, and the second half being when their questing party enters Hephaestus' junkyard and fights Talos. I don't know why this was just 1 chapter, but I'll let that pass. Ares is back, but only briefly. Not much to say there. I don't really feel like anything's gonna come of his resentment of Percy. And he did say that his hands are tied because he doesn't want to ruin the potential of a good war, or that he wants to maintain his affair with Aphrodite, which meant that Percy was off limits when it came to being killed by the god of war. So there's no real threat to his words. Although, it would be interesting to see a full-on story arc of Percy fighting against Ares, but I doubt that'll ever happen. Talos was my favorite part of Jason and the Argonauts. The cinematic ingenuity of that whole sequence is arguably a dead art form. Ray Harryhausen was probably a demigod of some sort, or a minor god that's similar to Hephaestus or Daedalus. The skeleton warriors are also from Jason and the Argonauts, although I like them better in the movie. Last but not least, rest in peace Bianca D'Angelo. You felt like a 2-dimensional character to me, but that's only because you were killed off too early for me to build a connection to your character. If only you died in book 4 instead, your death would have made a better impact. Chapter 14, I have a damn problem. Rachel, Elizabeth, there. Rachel, Elizabeth, there. Rachel, Elizabeth, there. The angel statues were cool at the end. I like how Athena was just there to indirectly help them on their quest. That only makes me think that the rules of engagement when it comes to the gods towards their children are loose as hell, or entirely made up. I wish we could have learned who the hero of Zoe's story was in this chapter, because I have no clue who it actually is. Percy and I are lost in the sauce. I need to brush up on my Greek mythology. Oh, and Rachel Elizabeth there. Chapter 15, I wrestle Santa's evil twin. I love what just happened at the end of this chapter. It was very brief, but it was so powerful, so impactful that I stayed true to what I said in the first book. Mr. D, Dionysus, the god of wine, is one of the best characters in this series. He doesn't want you to think that he cares, because he secretly does. And the whole point of this facade that he's built for himself is a way to weed out the many people who take him for granted. You have to remember that this is the god of wine, the god of parties, of ecstasy, and the madness that all brings. He's the party god, so probably he's gotten this reputation of being outgoing, free-spirited, and overall an easy god to be around. He's not a threat, at least to the eyes of those on the outside looking in. But he is useful. Hell, with the example he presented in this chapter, he's goddamn powerful. And I guess he understood and recognized his own worth. Maybe even during the early years of a century-long punishment, that he started to become aloof, reclusive, and irritable towards those who looked down on him. I mean, being a dick sort of gave that side effect unintentionally, but in this chapter, we see that he only really asks for a little bit of faith in him from the ones he's been guarding in the camp. And that's even more proven by him calling Percy by his correct name unironically. He cares, but he also knows his self-worth, and that's why he walks in the middle of those 2 philosophies. Mr. D is the MVP of this series, and I just hope he doesn't become problematic in the latter books. Chapter 16, we meet the Dragon of Eternal Bad Breath. Annabeth's mortal family makes sense. It makes sense that in her perspective, they're the most annoying, diabolical family she could ever have. Because they're too nice and naive, and she's got that fatal flaw of hubris. I like them though. Although I also kind of get how that setup can be infuriating at times. The stagnancy of that lifestyle isn't something I wish for myself. The hero in Percy's dream, the one connected to Zoe Nightshade, Crusade is Hercules. But enough about that. Why give Percy such a powerful and useful item such as the Nemean lion's golden fur coat if he's just gonna throw it away? I get that it gives him a high defense, but he's still vulnerable at a large degree. The jacket could have been a cool outfit for him, or he could have passed it on to Thalia or Zoe. Why throw it away into the water? I don't get it. Seems like a waste of potential. The scene with the Hesperides and the multi-headed dragon were very brief. I wish it was a little bit longer. Chapter 17. I put on a few million extra pounds. If this was the final battle of this book, then it's a damn good one. Considering that Percy was basically out of it and had to narrate what was going on around him while holding up the tremendous weight of the skies above. It's such an ingenious way to describe the events of a battle. Kind of like a third-person limited or a second-person perspective narration, where Percy's a bystander while all of this stuff went down. Artemis's clutch fight scene was honestly pretty cool to read. She's been carrying the Titan's curse for how many days now, and yet as Percy took the burden from her, she was still ready to go full goddess mode on Atlas. I could imagine like an anime-style fighting animation as I read the part where she turned into various animals and moved so fast that Percy couldn't keep up with what was actually happening. This is a great chapter, but Annabeth's dad coming in at the last second was also really cool to see. A bit out of the blue, seeing a mortal suddenly enter the fight, but I guess I can brush that off as this is the kind of thing that attracted Athena to this man, and that's pretty hardcore. Chapter 18. A friend says goodbye. Not much to say about this chapter. Zoe passed away in this one. This was just a transition from the final battle to the last two chapters of this book. Nothing more. There was that conversation between Annabeth and Percy regarding Luke though. Does Annabeth have an empathy link with Luke? With the way she spoke of him, it kind of sounds like she physically knows that he's still alive after that fall from the last chapter. Guess we'll find out sooner or later. Chapter 19. The gods vote how to kill us. The penultimate chapters are always the best ones to read than the actual final chapters of a book. I guess because you know that the final chapter ends the story you've enjoyed and invested your time on with all your heart. That's not always the case, of course, but for this one in particular, makes me not want to end it just yet. The Council of the Gods was a great scene, but it was incomplete. Hades and Hestia weren't mentioned at all. Hades was mentioned by Athena for not breaking the rule of having another child, which means that Hades has the power to deceive the other gods, but other than that, he was never described to be among the council in this chapter. Hestia wasn't described or mentioned at all, maybe because that's how Riordan designed it to be. She's the main focus of the last book, so I get why she's being hidden from the mind of the reader, but not very well, I might say. The lack of her presence only makes me think of her even more. Dionysus was indifferent towards the demigods, and that only proves my point from an earlier chapter. He cares enough not to show that he cares. He can't be too attached to the people he looks after, because losing them will make it that much more difficult for him to endure. Other than that, this was a solid chapter. Thalia's now a hunter of Artemis, and Athena disapproves of Percy's friendship with Annabeth. If I was ever told by a mother of the girl that I liked that she disapproved of me for her daughter, that would probably make me try to double down even more. Chapter 20. I get a new enemy for Christmas. So technically, Bianca and Nico D'Angelo aren't the byproduct of Hades breaking the oath he and his two brothers swore to uphold after the last World War. They were born before World War II and were just stuck in the Lotus Hotel until they were taken out by an unknown character, forced to become new pieces on the board. The chapter ends with Grover telling Percy and the others that Pan spoke to him, and I guess book 4 will focus on the quest for Pan. I'll reserve my opinion on that for now. I know I talked badly of how Grover just doesn't interest me at all, but I'm gonna give him another try in book 4. I can't quite remember the events of the Battle of the Labyrinth, since it's been a long time that I haven't read that book. I think Daedalus appears, and we get a rematch from Percy and the Minotaur. Or maybe I'm confusing that with Hades, the video game. I don't really have much to say about this book, other than it was a great middle part of the whole first series. It's action-packed, but not as fast-paced as The Sea of Monsters, despite both books having the same exact number of chapters. The Titan's Curse was a bit more slow-feeling and a bit more serious. It reminds me of the massive shift that happened between the first two Harry Potter movies and The Prisoner of Azkaban. The third movie had such a darker tone to it that gave the movie series such a better feel to it moving forward. If it had been all jolly and lighthearted as how the first two movies looked and felt like all the way through, then I probably wouldn't have liked the Harry Potter movies. But because it was so dark and moody, it gave that sort of edge to the movies that I really enjoyed. But going back to the Titan's Curse, the only similarity is within that tonal shift from the second book and then the third book. The Lightning Thief sort of had a similar vibe to the Titan's Curse, where it allowed for great fun action sequences while also recognizing that it's not all sunshine and rainbows. There were fundamentally serious moments sprinkled throughout the story, throughout Percy's adventures, that the second book never really felt like having. And with the Titan's Curse, the stakes are even higher. The quest is much more dangerous, and lives were lost along the way. This is the first book where a significant character or characters have died. I know that Gabe Agliano was hilariously just written off at the end of the first book, but that's different. Let's not try to dissect the whole ethics of that character's death. Even if Sally Jackson did just straight up murder a person. Not even a Greek monster or demigod of some sort. Just a straight up normal ass dude. But again, let's move on from that hullabaloo. Zoe and Bianca are gone, and that's what makes this a good book. Not because they died, but because of what their deaths represent in the overall story. Bianca wasn't a great character, but her death meant that Percy wasn't always gonna win all of his battles. It was to remind us that Percy's not a perfect character by any means. He may come across as a Mary Sue at times, but this is where he loses that stigma. Zoe, on the other hand, was a great fleshed out character. I remember not really liking her the first time I read this book, but in this recent reading of mine, I really liked her overall arc in the story. She's been alive for so long, has served under Artemis as a hunter, and has seen the world in its many phases, that her death felt like a completion and the literal conclusion to her story. Percy being the new wielder of Anaklusmos or Riptide also lends closure to Zoe's backstory with Hercules. I like how these books subvert so many of the things that we've come to know and love about Greek mythology, but still manages to make it thematically work in the plot's favor. It doesn't happen all the time, especially in book 2 with the god-awful half-baked world-building setup for the Hydra's many heads, but it's the effort that counts, I guess. Luke was written really well in this book. He had lesser screen time, and his scenes weren't annoying to me. I don't know what Rick Riordan was aiming for with book 2's handling of Luke. I really don't understand the thought process that went down when writing The Sea of Monsters. But the Titan's Curse fixes that problem really well. That's all I'm gonna say. Oh, and Rachel Elizabeth there. Thanks again for watching this book review video. Did you have the same opinions as I did with this book? Did you have differing opinions? Let me know in the comments below. I'm happy to read all of them. If you want to see my review of book 4 ahead of schedule, then become a member of this channel, and you can also gain access to members only content and other upcoming videos in the channel. This is Elmo's Universe, and I'll see you in the next one.